We'll start with Yair. Please.
Thank you very much, Shlomo, for the kind introduction. Indeed, some of the people who are sitting here used to be my students, including you. But I would add immediately, and of course Emily, that's the first one, and several others, but using the famous Hebrew phrase, Mikol Talmidai Iskalti, namely from all my students I have gained wisdom, or I would immediately apply it to the audience here, because indeed, and this is true, I am learning all the time from my own students. So thank you. What I'm going to do today, very quickly, according to the mandate I have received, is to discuss briefly the possibility that, as Shlomo mentioned, that Iran will become a nuclear power. And then what happens? To what extent a balance of deterrence, or rather a nuclear relationship or a nuclear deterrence relationship between Israel and Iran would be stable or not? I think this is a key question about a nuclear relationship. Not only how we deter Iran, and obviously Iran deters Israel, but how much stability is comprised, is encapsulated in this relationship. Secondly, I'll add something briefly about the question of extended deterrence in the region, which is partly related, not partly, directly related to the question of stability of nuclear relationships between Israel and Iran. Let me just beforehand add something to the debate we had in the last panel, and Giora Eiland mentioned, and I agree completely with him, the list of considerations and conditions that Israel or Israeli leaders should bear in mind when they are considering the possibility of a military option vis-à-vis Iran. And let me add an additional consideration, or two additional considerations, which need not be necessarily dependent on knowledge or intelligence or secret intelligence, but on the assessment, a commonsensical assessment of a possible Israeli strike against Iran, and that is the future relationship between Israel and the people of Iran. And I think this is a very important consideration, and when I was sort of challenged, motivated to raise this point because of the debate that went on in Israel over the past 2 or 3 weeks, actually beforehand. It seems to me that when there is the argument, only those who have all the secret information can really make a decision whether to attack Iran or not. I agree completely that a lot depends on this information, to what extent the Israeli strike might be effective or not, and all the rest of it. But there are wider considerations one has to look at in a historical perspective, and it seems to me that the consideration would be the long-range effects of an Israeli military strike at Iran in terms of Iranian-Israeli relationships in the future. And almost immediately, I think this is an important consideration. And obviously, this is loaded with uncertainties, I agree, but this is something that we have to bear in mind. Going back again to the military option and so on, I think this is quite obvious, that although I personally am against military strike because a whole range, Israeli military strike, not an American, a whole range of considerations, including the one that I have mentioned here, it seems to me that the possibility of a military action against Iran, a credible threat of a military action, is a very important bargaining card in the negotiations that hopefully will take place with Iran. Saying that, I'll move to the main topic of what I am discussing. Well, stability of nuclear deterrence relationships is, of course, a question, again, loaded with uncertainties. Deterrence in general, although we have a theory of deterrence, a very advanced and intricate theory or theories of deterrence, obviously a lot is loaded with uncertainties, And also, as we all know, there are basic paradoxes involved in any deterrence relationship. So we have to bear that in mind. Saying that, I would mention several points. First of all, there is a huge literature on the effects of nuclear proliferation on international stability, but also, and this is relevant to our discussion, on the relationship between emerging nuclear powers in different regions. It seems to me there is already a lot of literature, and as we all know, there are basic two schools of thought about it. One which argues, and the latest proponent of that is Kenneth Waltz, of course, that we all know, that argues that in fact the introduction of nuclear weapons into a region would stabilize conflict relationships within the region. So this is one school of thought, and I would argue, not argue, but I would just mention for our knowledge that in fact this argument has been there since the 50s, but basically since the 60s, starting in France with Galois and Prof and so on, and then was echoed in India and other places, and in Israel as well. This I would like to add. So this is one point of view, one argument, why in fact in the introduction of nuclear weapons into a region would stabilize relationships there. Interestingly, the introduction of the Israeli nuclear capability, this belongs to a different different discussion. I wouldn't elaborate on it because I'm going to talk about Israeli-Iranian relationship. But the introduction of only the Israeli nuclear capability in a very strange way has not or did not overall stabilize strategic relationships between Israel and Arab countries. But this is just a footnote to what I'm saying. This is incidentally a debatable point. This is not something which is accepted by many scholars and practitioners, but I just mentioned it in passing. But what about an Israeli-Iranian nuclear relationship? Now, obviously, the literature and any discussion would like to have a look at the historical perspective, or historical experience, rather. And we have two models of nuclear relationships. One, the obvious one, the major one, from which we can glean most of the possible evidence, is the superpowers relationship during the Cold War. This is the obvious model of nuclear relationships. The second one, which I'll touch upon very, very briefly, is the Indian-Pakistani relationship. Again, two regional powers of nuclear capabilities that are facing each other, have been facing each other since when they commit, or when they had the tests in 1998, but actually even before that, but certainly from 1998 onwards. So we have two models of nuclear relationships. First, about the superpowers relationship, from which most Kenneth Waltz, but not only Kenneth Waltz, but other scholars as well, have, on the basis of which many of them have argued that in fact, the argument that I have mentioned before, that in fact, the introduction of nuclear weapons into high conflict regions would actually stabilize the relationships. If we look at the superpower relationship, I don't think that I make any new, mention any news here. I would argue that it took many years until the relationship between the two nuclear powers have really, or had really been stabilized. Obviously, there could be the argument that, in fact, from the very beginning, from 1949, when the Soviet Union acquired a nuclear capability, certainly since the late 50s, when it had the capability to reach the United States, or mid-50s, there had been established a stable balance of nuclear relationship, which deterred not only an attack by one nuclear power against the other, but also deterred even other major conflicts, armed conflicts, for instance, in Europe, where the system of extended deterrence applied. On the other hand, one might argue that if we look closely at this relationship, we can see that there were a lot of instabilities involved in it, There were several flashpoints. The most famous, of course, is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Again, incidentally, I'm sure you have seen the latest book on that. I already published about 2 years ago, which focuses on the last day of the crisis. When I read it, I was really not only amazed, I was frightened, because in the last day of the crisis, just before the resolution of the crisis, of the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were several steps by the two sides which verged on an escalation to a nuclear confrontation. So I'm just mentioning it as an example how even within the context of the superpower nuclear relationship, there were a lot of potential instabilities, and there was a lot of effort which was invested during the 60s, 70s, and 80s in order to stabilize the relationship. And even in the 80s, there were situations when, in fact, the fear of an escalation to a nuclear confrontation was there. So it seems to me that to look at the superpower relationship and to say, aha, this is a model for stability in nuclear relationships is problematical, at least. This is one point. The second point is to look at the various components of the nuclear relationship between the two superpowers and try to study them and to look. You look already at the watch. So.
That's Deterrence.
That's compelling, it's not Deterrence.
That's my job.
So I'll very quickly rush on. There are several, let me very quickly do it. There are several basic elements that are part of a nuclear relationship, a nuclear deterrence relationship, which can contribute to stability or instability. There are the technological factors like second strike capabilities, like elaborated advanced command and control systems, like the structure of nuclear weapons themselves. There are historical and political factors which are contextual factors within which a nuclear relationship is conducted. There are important cognitive factors which affect the way in which decision makers behave primarily in a situation of crisis. And there are, of course, other additional factors which are related to it, for instance, the structure of the region within which the whole relationship is conducted, which relates to geostrategical context within which the relationship is conducted. For instance, the obvious notion that the superpowers was a bipolar relationship, basically, whereas in the Middle East, I'm moving to the Middle East, we are living in a multipolar system in which only two powers will become nuclear. I mean, Iran and Israel under this scenario, but other important actors are operating. I think that one has to focus on second strike capabilities or command control systems and what I would call learning processes. It seems to me that the superpower relationship involved a long process of learning of how to behave with nuclear weapons, how to react to nuclear weapons, understanding the nature of nuclear weapons. It's amazing how even in the superpowers, after 20 or 30 years of quote-unquote, the process of learning, we witness positions, for instance, in the United States among some of the people involved in the Reagan administration and in the Soviet Union as well, that when you look at how they reacted to a nuclear capability, you are quite taken aback because of the lack of understanding of what it means to have a nuclear capability and what it means to have stable deterrence between the sides. So what I'm concerned primarily if Iran becomes a nuclear power, and I still have 5 minutes, 7 minutes.
I tell you when
You
you
tell,
have 5
okay.
minutes.
So what I'm primarily concerned about if Iran becomes a nuclear power, this is besides the question of how it will affect the Israeli strategic, in fact, dominance in the region, which is very important. And incidentally, it seems to me that if Iran becomes a nuclear power, then what I would call escalation dominance, a term that many of you No, it seems to me that whereas Israel now, presently, enjoys a large margin of escalation dominance under different military scenarios in the region, if Iran becomes a nuclear power, then Israel might lose or will lose at least part of this strategic escalation dominance situation. But what I'm more concerned about is behavior under crisis situations. That is to say that if a crisis emerges, and the usual scenario, of course, are provocations by Hezbollah, Hamas, and all the rest of it, but not only that, if a crisis emerges, how the leaderships of both sides would behave. So we have a major question of crisis stability under nuclear conditions. And I have several comments, and I won't go into that. And let me just mention the Indian-Pakistani context. And again, there are two schools of thought, of course, one which would argue that the introduction of nuclear weapons into the Indian subcontinent, in fact, stabilized relationships. I would argue that the evidence is at least not clear, and there are some very valid arguments that, in fact, the introduction of nuclear weapons into the Indian subcontinent has destabilized or, in fact, encouraged also limited military moves, at least by Pakistan. My overall judgment, and then I'll say in 3 minutes something about extended deterrence. My overall judgment, not judgment, view about a possible emergent Iranian-Israeli nuclear relationship is that deterrence will work. That is to say that basically the two sides will be mutually deterred from using nuclear capability or nuclear weapons as a first strike against the other because of the fear of a reaction. This is the simplistic and elementary level of analysis of a nuclear relationship. I think this will work, and I just quote the famous British scholar Ben Jonson of the 18th century, that he said that when there is nothing that orders the mind or introduces sanity into the mind more than when somebody views the hanging ropes. So I think this is something on a basic level. However, I would argue that only great effort invested in enhancing some of the stabilizing factors in this relationship, this requires a lot of effort, thinking, and socializing the leaderships and lower levels of the administrations of both sides in the realities and the meaning of nuclear weapons. It's much more in Israel than in Iran, but this is a major problem. And of course we have basic problems, for instance, stability of regime. Obviously the regime in Iran is unstable, and for instance the one possible scenario is what happens if the Revolutionary Guards launch a coup d'etat in Iran and take over some of the launching sites of nuclear missiles. How would Israel react? So there is the danger or the motivation to strike first. So we have here a major problem under nuclear conditions, and the problems of decision under these conditions are enormous. Few words about extended deterrence. Few words about extended deterrence. It seems to me, I won't go into the whole thing, and there are many arguments in favor and against and all the rest of it, but it seems to me that one of the measures, that I can argue it at length, one of the measures that could contribute to the stability of this potential future nuclear relationship is a system of formal alliances among regional states with the United States as the central guarantor of this relationship. It seems to me that this would contribute. There are, of course, two parts to it. There is the part of the Gulf countries, which are the candidates for such an extended deterrence operation, and there is Israel. It seems to me, as far as the GCC countries are concerned, That is probably the best option from their point of view and from an American point of view, unless, of course, the Iranian nuclear effort is stopped. But absent that, it seems to me that this would fit an alternative American strategy of containment and deterrence of Iran. In order to achieve that, the United States, and in order to have the trust of the Gulf countries in the American system of commitments, which are at present there as well, it seems to me that a formal extended deterrence system must be introduced. If it is introduced towards the Gulf countries, it must be introduced towards Israel. Israel cannot be kept out of such a system. So this is one major consideration. The other major consideration from the Israeli-Iranian narrow nuclear deterrence relationship, it seems to me, is that the United States could inject several stabilizing elements into this relationship. So my concern is the stability of deterrence relationship, primarily under crisis situations. It seems to me the United States could play a central role in creating a situation where an escalation to the nuclear level could be avoided. Thank you.
Thank you, Yair.